Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today we'll be reviewing the Sony AN1000. I've been able to find it at a Best Buy near me. So if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's go for a drive. Now I've been playing with the Sony AN1000 for a little over a week. And if there was one word to describe my experience, it's been fantastic. If you want my short answer on whether you should buy the Sony AN1000 or not, by all means, go ahead and buy the Sony AN1000. It's one of the best receivers I've tested, and I've tested many from the Marantz 7015 to the Onkyo 6050, the Pioneer 305, and the Denon 3800H. After having tested all these receivers in the last 2 or 3 months, the Sony AN1000 cannot just keep its own when it comes to comparison with these receivers, but in many cases punches well above its weight and delivers an absolutely phenomenal value at $500. Now let's just talk about the specifications. Sony delivers 7.2 channels with options of 2 subwoofer outputs, no pre-outs for external amplification, and 120 watts of power at 6 ohms. Now, this is not a beast when it comes to specs, and if you're doing a more advanced setup with Atmos speakers, this is not the receiver for you. But for everyone else who's looking for 7.2 channels or less, this ticks all the right boxes. Apart from this, you do have an option of adding wireless surrounds from Sony, which I think is a big miss by other vendors, given the fact that most things are getting wireless these days, and having wireless surrounds is so very convenient from a quality of life standpoint. Now moving on, let's talk about the build quality. Now I had this to compare with the Marantz SR7015. And as soon as you lift this receiver, it's quite evident that the Sony is very light compared to the Marantz 7015, coming in just over 20 pounds compared to the Marantz that's well over 30 pounds. The Sony is also a lot less wider and taller. And that means that when it comes to fitting Sony in any media console, it's really very easy. Whereas with Marantz, you really have to plan the space to keeping such a big amplifier. If you look at the build quality of Sony, it is not the best, but what I do like is the modern aesthetics and design. Its jet black appearance is actually better than the grayish black that we have on Marantz. Now let's talk about room correction, and this is where Sony has cut some corners. It is very fast to set it up. It only takes 2 measurements to get your audio correction up and running, but it has no dissect, it has no Odyssey, and the room correction is fairly basic. One thing that did surprise me though was that after doing those 2 measurements, the distances that I got from the Sony correction is actually pretty similar to what I got from Odyssey on the Marantz. Now when it comes to user interface, Sony delivers something that all other vendors can learn from. It is really an iPhone experience compared to Nokia. Sony has the best user interface when it comes to setting up your amplifier. And not only that, the chipset and the CPU inside the Sony is fairly powerful compared to the competition, making it very easy when you're going through the menus, and the whole experience feels fast and snappy. And I know this is not something that you do on a daily basis. Amplifier, once it has been set up, is almost like a set and forget motion. But whenever I'm tinkering with the settings, I cannot help but notice the fast and snappy interface that the Sony delivers. Now, when I bought the Sony, I had really low expectations from the Sony. Given a $500 price point compared to $2,000 amplifiers that I was testing on this channel, I was like, okay, it's a $500 amp, what can it deliver? But I was so positively shocked by Sony. Now, the Sony is doing something with audio where it's coloring your music. It's got tight bass, and it's got bright highs which are not overly fatiguing. And the overall experience is cinematic. Now, let me explain in more details. What I observed with Sony was that when I was listening to the same song on the Sony and the Marantz, the Sony just felt that it had a slight kick. There was a punch in the vocals, especially at the mid-end, without them getting muddied. Whereas when I was listening to that same song on Marantz, it was more reference audio. Now, depending on what you like, you may like the sound from Marantz. But for me, honestly, 90% of the people are going to be impressed by what Sony is doing with their sound. And the good thing about the Sony is that they raise the vocals a little bit. So especially if you're going to be using this for home theater experience, the Sony delivers better dialogue intelligibility. Now, coming to some of the Sony's shortcomings, I could see that the subwoofer gains on the Sony has to be turned up to 60% to get the same output that I was getting from Marantz on 30%. And also the fact that Sony raises the vocals a little bit, you do miss out on the fact that the explosions in the movies are a little subdued. I was watching the scene from Ghosted on Apple TV, and when I was watching the scene on Mirans, the explosions were huge and you could really feel the bass rumbling and hitting your chest. But then you were also straining to listen to the dialogue. On the Sony, the experience was totally different. I could hear the dialogue very clearly without having to raise that voice. But it did come at the expense of the overall explosions, lacking that chest-thumping bass. Now let's talk about my final conclusions. And I had them written down because I want to make sure that I don't forget what I want to highlight. I had low expectations when I bought the Sony AN1000. Given its price point, I was not expecting much. But Sony has exceeded my expectations in every which way possible. Sony is perhaps offering not only the best audio quality, but the best user interface and the best chipset. Of all the receivers I've tested in this channel, Sony is the one that has delivered the best value so far. Just looking at the price alone, I have no qualms in recommending the Sony. Of course, if you're going to spend more, you're going to get more. But then the law of diminishing returns kicks in. Is a $2000 amp really 2 times or 4 times as better as Sony? It is not. Sony delivers the most bang for buck I've seen in any receiver. So with that, we come to the end of this review. If you have any questions, feel free to leave me a comment below. I'll be happy to answer them. And until next time, I want to thank you all for watching.